let's start with the question about mediumship. Um, I began doing research on the question of mediumship. I'm trying to remember, but it has to be probably more than 25 years ago, which is quite extraordinary when I think about it. Um, and the research began in secret because it was research that I was not doing because I had been a spiritualist or was even open to these ideas. Just as a sidebar, I had been trained in Western science. I've been raised in essentially an atheist home. I was taught that it was ashes to ashes, dust to dust, case closed, and I just assumed that that was true. And it wasn't until I was during my time as a professor of psychology and psychiatry at Yale University that I began to question all that and literally stumbled upon a theory and developed a theory, which, among other things, forced me to predict that not only was life after death possible, but was sort of required by our understanding of contemporary physics and system science. But that didn't mean I was going to do research in that area. It was just, a theory. And I didn't want to, there was nothing compelling me to do it other than that's where the evidence pointed. But then I had a series of experiences, actually mostly with women who had lost loved ones and really wanted to know whether their loved one's personality, consciousness, histories continued. And these women they came from different walks of life. Some were scientists, some were writers, some were just quote regular people. But they each approached me and beseeched me to help them or to help give them evidence. And so what I say to people is that I was pushed there by scientific theory and evidence, but I was pulled there by love. Linda's love for her father, Susie's love for her mother, Stratus Johnson's love for her husband. And when you're pushed and pulled in the same direction, it's very hard to resist. So I'm sharing that with you because when I began doing this work, not only did I begin doing it in secret, but also I did it with no knowledge of the history of the field. I didn't know about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Harry Houdini. I didn't know about the early work in the British Parapsychological Association or William James. I didn't know about any of the spiritualism movement and so on. And I didn't know also about other emerging literatures such as near-death out-of-body experiences or reincarnation. This was not part of my education. It was not part of my upbringing. And so I approached it with a childlike heart and interest, open-minded, but with all this background in science and experimental design and statistics and how to analyze data. And what happened was I was privileged to end up meeting some very gifted mediums who were really interested in science, and they considered themselves to be evidential mediums. And they wanted the world to know that they weren't frauds, that they weren't cold readers, that there was a real phenomena here. And I put them through ever more sophisticated experimental tests. And in every case, the mediums who were real, quote, passed those tests. To the point where my first book was published in 2002, which is 21 years ago, which is called The Afterlife Experiments, Breakthrough Scientific Evidence for Life After Death. And And I was in awe of not only their gifts, but in awe of a greater spiritual reality that I had no idea existed, and that the amount of love and caring that connected these both within and between these realms. Now, over the years, the research became ever more sophisticated. We ended up doing what are called single blind studies, and then double blind studies, and then triple blind studies. And a postdoctoral fellow who worked with me, who then created her own institute called Dr. Julie Beischel, she went on and even conducted five-way blinded experiments. Scientists, we get obsessed about experimental controls, particularly in controversial areas. And it became really clear that the conventional explanations could not account for this. And I reached the point where I didn't need any more scientific, quote, evidence to be convinced of it myself, nor did I feel that scientific evidence in that one area by itself would ultimately be convincing to the people who were extremely skeptical, or the quote disbelievers. And so I began to shift my focus to research on technology. And that work, I went public with that work, that meaning in terms of publishing a couple of key scientific papers in 2010 and 2011 on the use of supersensitive state-of-the-art technology to detect the energy of spirit, the presence of the info energy systems that comprise our quote energy bodies and so on. And I did that work always in collaboration with gifted mediums. And so that's the kind of work that I've focused on. And I have left the continued development of mediumship research to others. The one thing I can say, though, is that I've maintained relationships, and particularly private research relationships with special mediums, and they in turn have written books about research that they've done with me through their practices and the like. And I can honestly say that I mean, I could not, well, first of all, I have witnessed hundreds and hundreds of research readings in a laboratory setting over, the past quarter of a century. And I have witnessed probably thousands that were just more, quote, informal. And after all that time, I'm never, what's the word? I'm always struck with awe and wonder and gratitude and celebration for the for both the phenomena, including its mysteries. There are a lot of mysteries, as you know, with mediumship. We could talk about some of them if you'd like. But the mysteries and the challenges, the difficulties that most mediums have, even the very best, are, the what's the word? The more intellectual and spiritual questions about all of this are really, in some respects, more interesting than just knowing that it's real. I think there are three levels here. So let's first talk about the very big picture. The very big picture is that the kind of research that points to survival of consciousness, let's just talk about the reality of a greater reality, the existence of a greater spiritual reality. And let's ignore, for example, theories from physics that point in that direction. Let's talk about data. there are many categories of data, each of which speak to life after death. And they have been discussed in many books, and the latest, you're probably aware of the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies and the contest that they had and so on. And there are these bodies of work, and the major ones are near-death experiences, there's after-death communications, there's reincarnation in children, there's deathbed visions, there's mediumship research, and the latest, of course, is the technology research. Each of those bodies of evidence have very compelling data. No one of those areas by itself is, quote, proof. Although the one that would become the closest to providing proof, is, they all provide truth, but the one that's closest to providing proof is actually the technology, for the reason that I'll explain, but it has not reached that level that you'd call the proof level, and I'll get to that. But each of these individual level areas by themselves are not, quote, definitive. But when you put them all together, the convergence of the evidence, the consilience of the evidence, the whole is far greater than the sum of its parts. And there is no other alternative explanation that can account for all of that evidence. So, when you have a body of evidence where all of its evidence points in that direction, and the conclusion that I say is the single best theory that accounts for the largest amount of the evidence, and also proposes hypotheses and experiments that could be proved or disproved in future research, that hypothesis is the survival of consciousness hypothesis. And it's very easy to come to that conclusion if you know all the evidence. Now, within all that area, then we go to the specific domains. Mediumship within that, as one of those categories, is one that is quite strong, and what's interesting about mediumship compared to the others is that it can be, quote, brought into the laboratory. Right now, we don't do, near-death experience research where we intentionally, quote, kill people or have them, and then study them during these periods of time. There's very ethical reasons for not doing that. Okay. But mediumship research you can bring into the laboratory. Mediums can be brought in, they can do this under controlled circumstances. And I think you and your audience probably knows that well, or can read any of these, latest books and so on. But what are called meta-analyses, where they've put the various studies together. There's a debate about which studies you include and which studies you don't include, which is always the case with meta-analysis. But again, the meta-analysis also, in general, support that same conclusion. Even when you limit it to the very best studies, the better the studies are, the clearer the conclusions are. So the mediumship research, again, if you know the research, it's hard to come to, a different conclusion. Also, and this is where sophistication in the research area becomes important. So, for example, there are conditions which are optimal for obtaining positive results. So, for example, if you want to achieve positive results, you want to have skilled mediums who are evidence-oriented, who are minimally stressed, and can get into a state where they can feel comfortable receiving information and not worrying about whether it's correct or not, and not trying to, quote, target it. You also need to be able to have sitters, and for whom loved ones there's a strong emotional bond and a reason for them to connect in this context. And thirdly, you want to be able to design the research in such a way that it as closely as possible reflects what mediums really do in order to be able to receive the information that they get. Because scientists very often design these very naive kinds of experiments trying to be, quote, controlling, and they don't realize they're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And I wrote about that in 2002. So, if you know these areas of work, and you're sophisticated at all, you realize that, yeah, it's very easy to not get a positive result, and then say, therefore, quote, there's no phenomena because you didn't get it under your circumstances. One of the things, by the way, sidebar, that I have been very impressed with is how easy it and how fragile mediumship is with the very best, what I call Michael Jordans of the mediumship world. Michael Jordan was a basketball player, or now the LeBron James or the Steph Currys of basketball. How easy it is to have the very best medium's performance deteriorate, if not be completely impaired. And again, the details of how you do that are not important right now, but I can design very simple experiments and under circumstances with the very best mediums that and I know they're Michael Jordans, but they can't do the task. It's like saying, okay, we want you to see whether you get the balls in the basket, but you have to do it wearing blindfolds. Well, most people at a free throw line, if they put a blindfold on, they're going to miss most of their shots, even if they know where the basket is. I mean, there are just certain things that you can do that interferes with performance. But if you don't know what it is that is not just optimal, is not optimal, but is actually interfering, you can have the phenomena disappear. So the sophistication is a factor. And again, there's been an article written recently, and I'm forgetting his name. I see it, but I can't say it. He's a Brazilian scientist, but they've written a methodological analysis of the optimal conditions to obtain mediumship, not from just a control, removing fraud or removing, making vague general statements, but optimizing the conditions for getting a positive result as opposed to, okay. The third area is in the technology. And the technology area, which is the one that I've been focusing on for the past 10 years, I'd like to draw the distinction between proof of concept and proof of product, proof of practicality, as opposed to proof of possibility. So there's a proof of possibility versus a proof of practicality. And when you look at the totality of the data that we've collected, much of which is still not published, partly because of issues of intellectual property in the business world, and part of which I would like to actually, if it's all right, have a little conversation on toward the end of this conversation about the ethics of all this work and also potential abuse. But when you look at the totality of the data, there is no question that we have achieved in our research proof of possible, proof of concept, and we've even developed a paradigm for being able to do multi-center double-blind experiments, replicating the very things that we have done in the lab, quote, over and over. And there's no question that we get a real phenomenon. And the metaphor that I use is like a Wright brothers moment in the history of flight. Prior to the Wright brothers in the early 20th century, there were no powered airplanes, and nobody knew whether it was possible to have flight. And many people had tried and failed, in fact, died. But then on that one fateful day in Kitty Hawk, 5 people witnessed this, wooden and paper and cloth plane take off. It had no windows, it had no chairs, there were no stewardesses. I mean, there was nothing that we just take for granted for flight today. I think the first flight lasted about all of 14 seconds or whatever. I don't remember the details of it. And then the plane finally crashed. And it was completely impractical. But we knew that flight was possible. And that, by the way, the second time that when they tried to do it, the wind wasn't strong enough and the plane crashed, and they had to build it again, and the third time, and so on. So, but once you knew it was possible, then it became an engineering challenge to go from proof of possible to proof of practical. So we've been spending the past, particularly, I would say, 4 years now on trying to see whether we call it tunnel emergence. So we're in the tunnel and we can see the end of the tunnel. We're seeing light at the end of the tunnel, but we have not arrived through the tunnel. And the issue is primarily an issue of signal to noise, because the amount of the intensity of, quote, physical energy, be it femtoamp changes in current flow, or the behavior of single photons of light in a pitch black environment. We now have the technology to be able to measure these ultra tiny changes. And we have the statistics and the paradigm to be able to, using techniques both from astrophysics and also in EEG recording, what's called the evoked potentials, you can do some very clever things and decrease the signal to noise ratio. The problem is, as you get higher and higher sensitivities, you also pick up unanticipated noise problems, which have been the, what's the word? The Achilles heel almost of this work. And maybe that's not quite the right phrase. So let me give you an example. We were doing research detecting the capacity for our hypothesized spirit collaborators. We call them, you've probably heard of the term post-material psychology and post-material science, but we refer to them as PMPs, or post-material persons or post-material participants. We affectionately refer to them as the A team, and we're the B team, because they know a lot more about what the other side is like than we do. And that includes very distinguished scientists. And and we were studying the capacity to see whether or not we could detect subtle shifts in the absorption and reflection of light passing through a PMP's hand. As you know, quote, spirit of PMPs can appear fully formed. That's why certain mediums who can see spirit. They see a body, they see jewelry, they see clothing, they see hair. It's all, there. And they can engage in tasks just like we can. And just in the same way that we obviously block a beam of light, in principle, they should be able to not block, but they should be able to subtly alter the behavior of light passing through them under controlled circumstances. And we developed super sensitive technology, using optical tables in the whole 9 yards, and multi-reflecting mirrors, so we could pass the light back and forth through the hand over and over again, so you could accumulate the effects. I mean, we did very creative things. And we built this piece of apparatus, and then we couldn't use it. You know why? Well, first of all, any kind of vibration, any car in the driveway or a block away would produce bigger effects than them, because the effects were so great. But secondly, we couldn't calibrate the mirrors because the system was so sensitive. We're using micrometer mirrors. The problem was that our body heat walking up to the equipment, and so we didn't have, unless you've got a completely environmentally controlled situation and you've got the technology to be able to control them remotely, where you're not imposing heat like this, you're immediately producing confounding variables. That takes a lot of money. And so there's been a challenge of, it's not that we don't have the technology to be able to develop this kind of precision and measurement, it's that we don't have the resources now to implement it. And most people who have money don't see what it would mean. They don't recognize what it would mean if it was really possible to produce what for the lay public we call a soul switch, a binary switch that would be the equivalent of a keystroke. Because if you could go from proof of concept to proof of practical, and what do I mean by proof of practical? Where when our PMP makes a response within a finite period of time, we could be 99% sure that it was them and not an artifact. And if you can do it for one switch, then you can do it for 40 switches. If you can do it for 40 switches, you have a keyboard. If you have soul texting, you've now got direct communication, just like we communicate by email and text all the time. And for the first time ever, real communication becomes possible. The issue is not technological, and the issue is not conceptual. It's ultimately engineering, practical. And if you don't have the resources to create the quote clean rooms and to have the people who have the expertise in the various components working collaboratively as a team, you can't make that quote breakthrough. So what's happened is that we've gone from where it would take us 10 or 12 hours of data collection and analysis to where we can now, probably within 5 minutes, get an average single response that is statistically significant. Now that's a huge increase in time and practicality. But if you have to wait 5 seconds for a key press, and then you're not 100% sure it's statistically true, but it's not 99% true, then it's not a practical communication device. So we're getting closer and closer to having, eventually an airplane that would fly. And I say we, it's not just we as, the team that I lead, but we as humanity, and also them to be able to, together with us, produce those kinds of effects. And we're in the process. I'm hoping that by the end of the summer or early fall, is we're going to have a book tentatively called The Soul Phone Experiments that lays out enough of the research and the case for the soul phone, including its opportunities and its pitfalls, and as well as, which includes its potential abuse and why humanity, this is not a technology that should be, quote, available until we can treat it with the reverence, respect, gratitude for being able to have such an opportunity. Oh boy, that is a beautiful question. First of all, let's assume that we have genuinely open-minded, curious, and willing to be educated researchers who are not coming in thinking they know the answers or that their explanations are correct. And so they approach what a spiritualist, for example, a medium and someone who is more broadly spiritual, can share with them. So they'll listen with an open mind and an open heart. I call that loving openness. Or as my writing partner once referred to me, he was the writing partner actually for the Afterlife Experiments book, as well as I wrote a book called The Energy Healing Experiments and also the GOD Experiments. He used to describe me as being an orthodox agnostic. And what he meant by that was whether the question was, is there gravity or is there God? My response is, I don't know, could be yes, could be no. Show me the data, I'm open. And the plus side of being an orthodox agnostic is that you're willing to listen to anything, you're willing to entertain, and you're willing to be wrong, you're willing to have, you have humility, you're willing to enter, you're seeking the truth, and you're going to follow the data where it takes you. You're not going to be prejudging whether something is true or not. And I've discovered that makes actually for a very good scientist, because it leads you to be open to surprises and to be, willing to change your mind as a function of what you learn. The downside, by the way, turns out to be personal, because if you have, quote, a disease called science, which I do, I call it a disease, because I'm going to sidebar and say, what do I mean by disease? Because I sort of can't help myself. Somebody tells me something, they'll share some curious idea or experience they have, or some crazy whatever, and what'll happen is I'll hear their experience. It'll then get translated into a question. Then a question will become a hypothesis. Then the ideas will suggest themselves about how way that you can address this question. And then a thought experiment will pop into my head. If I had the time, I had the money, resources, and so on, whether I could do the experiment, and then what could I conclude? And it's so much of who I am, and I've been doing it for so many years, decades, that it's sort of I sort of can't not do it. It's just part of who I am. And I met actually a neurosurgeon a few years ago who was very spiritually oriented, and I told him about my disease, and he gave it an official diagnosis. He calls it scientitis, which I thought was pretty good. And so I have a chronic case of scientitis. I don't think it's treatable, but even if it was, I would not seek the treatment. So anyway, you need scientists who are going to be open, who are going to listen with an open mind and a heart, and say, okay, what would this mean? How would we go about testing this? How could we know or not know whether it's true? What meaning would this have for the things that we know in whatever field it is, psychology, biology, physics, whatever, based on what this means? So you need an open-minded scientist. But then you also need open-minded people in spirituality, people who are also willing to be open, to learn, to recognize that not everything that they were taught is necessarily the whole truth, is not necessarily completely accurate, and that all of us should be forgiven for our relative lack of knowledge or relative lack of discernment about what's the wheat and what's the chaff, what's the core essence and what's not. But if you can bring such a team of people together under the optimal conditions, the opportunity for mutual education and growth, both personally and professionally, and in service to the greater good, both here and quote there, is huge, I think. Unlike you, I am not a medium. I do not see or hear spirit under most circumstances. And I always sort of joke and say I'm like a blind man studying color vision. So I have to depend on people who can see to give me the core phenomena that to then help ask questions about and seek answers to. In terms of potential abuse, there are many. I think the greatest abuse would be people who would get a hold of this technology, and I'm not talking about abuse as in abuse in terms of having false technology. A lot of people make claims that they have an app that can connect with spirit or a device that can connect with spirit. They make extraordinary claims in the absence of extraordinary evidence. I even wrote a book with that title. It honors Carl Sagan's comment about that. That's one level of abuse that but I'm talking about abuse of if we actually have a real technology. And one of my primary concerns has to do with people who would use it for political or military aims, particularly in the area of spying and in also identity theft. the potential abuse if you, and of course, the only way that you can anticipate potential abuse is to imagine you have technology and say, okay, if I wanted to use it for nefarious purposes, what kinds of things could I do with it? So the kinds of issues that are arising with AI in terms of unanticipated potential negative consequences for society, the soul phone, if it were to become real, would need substantial safeguards in order to minimize its abuse, both here and quote there. And right now, we're fortunate that we don't have a breakthrough technology. So it's not like the runaway train hasn't started yet. But my feeling is, and if I put a spiritual hat on, that it could be that the reason why we don't have a breakthrough yet is because we don't have the safeguards in place first. So if there's a higher intelligence, a divine intelligence, and in particular with this technology, wishes to, has wisdom, not just intelligence, but wisdom, it would hopefully help us grow to be better stewards and caretakers of ourselves and the planet before we were given the keys to this technology. I think that's enough that could be said about that. In terms of your question about where survival of research is going to go, I think that there's the issues of knowing that it's here, knowing that it's real, and all the transformations that could take place in terms of two of my favorite and extremely difficult challenges for humanity is, especially if a soul phone comes along, but even if it doesn't, the first thing has to do with, if there is no death, there's only transformation, then the way that we allow people to die presently is truly savage and horrific. The truth is, we're kinder to our pets than we are to our parents. And so the notion of dying with dignity and being able to physically transition in a way that you could be prepared and look forward to future evolution would affect the grieving process, obviously. There's all that whole area. A second area has to do with increasing integrity for maintaining relationships, including both abuses of inheritance and also people's, even their names. It's the word that I'm searching for. I can't believe I'm blocking on this word. When you take someone's name and present false information. It's isn't that funny? Anyway, it's defamation, the phenomenon of defamation. It's bad enough to defame someone if it's false when they're alive, but it also is really horrific if you do it when somebody is deceased, because not only does it hurt the people who are living that love them, but it also hurts those who have died. You can say, well, people don't care anymore about what you think about them, but they care that their loved ones are hurt and are being hurt. And they also care about truth. And caring about truth doesn't just disappear because you've transitioned to another state of being. Also, very often, for example, money has been given in people's wills, and then their children fight over how it's going to be used, or even worse, money is given for causes. So you take some of the quote wealth that you've accumulated and you wanted to go to a university to support particular research or to support a particular charity. And then after the person's died, and the money gets reapportioned for some other purpose. Well, to what extent do you have the right, if you haven't died, is there some way that you should be able to have some say in how your funds are spent after you've passed? Or what if you come up with a technology, you're a scientist, you come up with some application that would benefit humanity and you help humanity to develop that technology? If you want, should you have some say in how it's developed, particularly if it's going to be used for purposes that are not in your ideal? And you can even ask the question about, well, if it's quote your idea, shouldn't you have the right, for example, if some of those funds were yours, if you were here in the physical, maybe you'd like to have those funds given to your grandchildren, albeit, but you've now done it from the other side. There are so many questions that get put on the table once we start thinking about, well, what if the public began to really accept that this was real? Are there post-material person's rights? Are there responsibilities? Huge questions, and I think they will require a lot of reflection. I would say it is first and foremost fundamental truth seeking. I'm old fashioned, where I genuinely care about truth, regardless of what it is, whether I like it or whether I dislike it, whether I approve of it or not approve of it. One of the greatest gifts we as humans have is the capacity to learn things and know whether something's real or not. And so it doesn't really matter whether it's survival of consciousness or the existence of angels or any other spiritual realm or anything in the physical world. Part of the driving force, of course, is truth seeking. And that's number one. Number two is a sense of responsibility to seek truth that is of service to humanity and the greater good. You could say it's an ethical sense, it's a spiritual sense. I can approach it from different points of view. For me, they're sort of all merged because they're all pointing in that direction. But to the extent that you can do things that are quote win-win-win-win-win, they win for the individual and they win for relationships and they win for larger elements of quote society, but also are good for now, not just the person in their physical form. You take a longer and bigger view. So even though I am not a pastor, I am not a religious, person in that sense, I went into psychology caring about the human mind and the human heart. And then when I discovered that mind and heart continues after physical death, I care about people's minds and hearts, i.e., quote, their souls, whether they're here or there. And to the extent that what you do here has bearing on there, and what you do there has bearing on here, especially if there's a recycling process and an evolution process, then this is probably one of the most important issues facing humanity. And we do a lot of very unfortunate things to each other because we don't know, out of ignorance of all of this. So my motivation for this, I began to see it was much bigger, in a much larger context, and therefore felt it was really, really important. Also, this may sound, so it's not just to help a grieving parent make peace with the fact that their child may have died, and also maybe have them look forward to being able to be reunited with their child if they like in the future, or even continuing a relationship with them right now if they wish, or with a spouse. Yes, all of that's very important to me, but it's not just simply reducing people's pain and suffering. It's much broader. And I also see, when I put on a bigger lens, that survival of consciousness is a step to even bigger questions. So for me, I happen to have I'll call this this is a quote pet interest, no pun intended, and not just a pet interest in survival of consciousness of your pets and animals and all that kind of stuff. But I have a pet interest in what I call the saint hypothesis, the idea that certain people who are quote bigger than life in this life, who are deeply loving and caring, that they can be given the opportunity and choose to continue to be of service to people on this planet, for example, if they wish, in the form of in a religious context, and that there may be truth to the idea that you can pray to specific saints with the right intentions and will sometimes receive guidance and help from these people who are so caring. If that was true, it would be so much, what's the word I'm searching for? It places, quote, humanity in a higher, greater light. And then imagine that there are even higher beings, the quote, angel hypothesis. And I published a book in 2011 called The Sacred Promise, How Science is Discovering Spirit's Collaboration with Us in Our Daily Lives, where the last quarter of the book, I applied it to the quote, angel hypothesis. And I showed that you could apply the technology that we've been developing, both with mediumship and with actual technology, to detect the presence of physical people and extend that to angels to the extent that they wished to collaborate in research and they wished their presence to be known. And so for me, my motivation is multi-level, and I think that on top of that, I then feel a moral and ethical responsibility to continue to play a role in nurturing that to unfold, and where, although I would prefer there to be saints, prefer there to be angels. I'd rather there be a universe of a infinitely compassionate, and intelligent mind. My job as a scientist is not to confirm the way I wish the universe to be. My responsibility is to help contribute to understanding how it really is. And so that's what I consider to be my moral and ethical job. But to the extent that these good things are on the horizon and the evidence is pointed that way, then I feel an added responsibility and gift of the opportunity to play a small role in that process.